Hey, welcome back to the How to Podcast series. It's Dave with you again. Hope you're doing well. Just had Canadian Thanksgiving yesterday. And I hope for all the Canadians listening, hope you had a great Thanksgiving. For all you Americans listening, it's coming for you eventually. So you'll have your Thanksgiving later. Anyways, we like starting our autumn off with Thanksgiving, like at the beginning of the Thanksgiving autumn season, not kind of the middle. But hey, there you go. It's Thanksgiving. We're happy to be back with you again for another episode of the How to Podcast series. And I want to talk about something that we should probably discuss, especially if you're a podcaster that has guests. When you have a podcast and you have guests on your show, eventually, maybe not at the very beginning, but eventually you're going to start getting emails from guesting agencies. These are organizations hired by people who want to be a guest on a show, that they hire this company, they hire these people, they come out, they find podcasts, and they try to match you as a guest with a potential podcast. Now, there's some amazing advantages to this for you as a host. There's some amazing advantages for you as a guest to make those connections, and that in-between person who makes it all happen, some great advantages. But at the same time, there are some equally interesting disadvantages to this as well, which we're going to talk about on the show. The disadvantages I don't hear people talk about often, so I thought I'd bring them up and at least make you think about them for your show. But the advantages, disadvantages of working with a guesting service to get a guest on your podcast. How does it give you an advantage as a guest? How does it give you an advantage as a host? And as well, how can it be a disadvantage for both parties working with an agency here on the How to Podcast series? Are you ready? Okay, well, let's get right to it. Thanks for being here. So you have a podcast. Congratulations. You're doing the thing. You're doing interviews. And you're trying to find guests. You can go on Facebook groups. You can go on, I use Podmatch with Alex Sanfilippo and his team. It's great. Alex has been on the show here as well to talk about Podmatch. That's a great service because it matches people with each other and gives you the opportunity to make connections, to have people on your show. That's a great option for you to consider for your podcast. But if you're going to work with an agency, this is an outside organization, kind of a bridge. Think of a bridge between two different parts. It's going to tie people who want to be a guest and tie podcasters who are looking for guests. They act as a middle person in between to make this thing happen. And it's a service that's available to you as a podcaster. And when I work with these companies, I found some amazing ones, by the way, and they know who they are. They give me great guests all the time. Every person they recommend to me has been a home run. I'm very happy with them. So there's some really big advantages to working with these companies. And as you podcast longer and get into this for the long term, you'll settle in with some agencies that really work well with you, and maybe some that don't really connect with you or send you guest recommendations that have nothing to do with your show. They're going to be pretty self-evident after time. Who's a good person to work with from this third-party organization as a guest service type option, and maybe who's not the best to work with. So I wanted to kind of talk today a little bit about some of the advantages and disadvantages, the benefits and drawbacks of working with a booking agency for your podcast. And I'm going to look at it from the lens of the guest. So if you're a guest listening to this and you're considering working with an agency, or you are currently working with an agency, some things to keep in mind as advantages and disadvantages of working with these agencies as well for the host of a podcast. You and me, as we work with these agencies, what is a great advantage to doing this? And maybe what are some things to think about where you're going to not experience all of the benefits that an agency offers to their guest as the host of the show, which could seem a little unfair in the moment, but you need to make a decision and a call for your podcast, understanding what works best for you. Podcast guesting agencies, they play a significant role in connecting guests with podcast hosts. Their impact varies for different parties involved, and I wanted today to just look at some of these benefits and potential drawbacks for both podcasters and guests. So a benefit for podcasters. What are they? Let's jump into that. So I kind of pinpointed 3 things that come to mind for me in my podcast journey. Again, I host 8 different podcasts, and I work with agencies for each of these podcasts to some degree or another. And I've kind of come across some benefits for me as a podcaster working with an agency. Okay, so one of them would be quality selection of guests. These guesting agencies often have access to a pretty wide and deep pool of guest opportunities and people looking to be on shows. And they have like super amazing experts who have hired these agencies to find them guest opportunities. And they can bring you some pretty amazing people that you would have a hard time finding on your own. This can really help you as a podcaster to get some really high quality guests who might not otherwise reach out to you, or you might have a hard time getting in touch with on your own, especially if you're a newer podcaster. As well, a benefit for podcasters working with an agency is going to be the savings of time. By working with these agencies, you as a podcaster can reduce the amount of time and effort you spend on emails back and forth, making connections, cold reaching out to someone who doesn't know who you are or never heard your show. It can be a little bit of work to find these connections with these people if you don't have somebody there in the middle kind of making it happen. This time investment that you don't have to make by working through an agency to find guests can allow you to focus on things that are more important, like podcasting or editing or social media or your family, walking your dog. These are all things that are really important. So you can save some time simply by working with an agency. And the other thing would be just having more of a consistent content flow. Agencies can help ensure that you get a steady stream of guests, which then is crucial for maintaining a regular publishing schedule for your podcast. So those are all benefits for a podcaster to work with an agency. At the flip side of this, there's actually some drawbacks for podcasters when working with an agency. Then again, I don't hear this mentioned quite often on podcasts. And to the agencies that listen to my show, I want you to listen to these concerns because there may be an opportunity to alleviate, minimize, mitigate some of these drawbacks. Because I know when I talk to podcasters, they grumble about this a little bit because they feel like they're not getting the full benefit of working with an agency from a podcast host side, the host of the show. They don't get all these benefits. So what are some of the drawbacks for podcasters to work with an agency? Well, I got 3 for you to consider. Here we go. So we get the email, agency reaches out to us as a podcaster. Hey, got this great guest, love to be on your show. Here's their bio, here's their information. Let's see if we can make a match. Awesome. But what's the drawback for a podcaster in this moment? Well, I think the biggest glaring one for me as a podcaster is the lack of financial compensation to the host of the podcast. See, without us as hosts of podcasts, there would be no business model for agencies to get guests onto podcasts. That makes sense, right? The guest hires an agency and pays them sometimes a lot of money to get them onto shows. So the money goes from the guest to the agency, and that's where it stops. There is no money that makes its way to the podcaster from the agency to sweeten the deal to have their guest on the show. Now, is this mandatory? No, I've never, ever been paid by an agency to have a guest on my show. And that kind of leads to the point where maybe if you are being compensated as a podcaster to have a guest through an agency or from the guest alone on your show, if there's money transactions happening to get that guest onto your podcast, I personally would tell you that needs to be disclosed to your audience. It's kind of a paid commercial in a sense. And you see those after those late night TV shows. This is a paid program for product A. And they have that predominantly displayed throughout the content that this is a paid commercial that looks like a TV show, right? The same thing I would say for podcasting. If there's any money transactions happening big or small, to get somebody onto your show, I would default as a podcaster to making sure people know that that's happened. To hide that, I think, is a problem in podcasting. And there's a lot of people who do this. And I think they should get their hand slapped, because it's probably not the best practice to create this expectation that you have to pay to play to get onto a podcast. But when we go back to just the transaction that happens between a guest and an agency, I don't know if the guests always realize that the agency is not giving any of that money to the actual host of the show. And back to my point at the beginning, had it not been for the podcaster themselves hosting the show and inviting guests on the show, and an agency using the podcast itself to get money to charge against guests, I just don't think guests realize that the hosts are not making any money from the agency at all, for the most part. And in that, I kind of feel like it's a significant downside for us as podcasters that we don't benefit at all from the money transaction happening between a guest and an agency. Again, because without the podcast, there is no need for an agency. True. So I would think that there would be something there for the host of a show on behalf of the agency that's been paid by a guest. That transaction feels not complete to me. It feels incomplete. So there's a lack of financial compensation that comes to a podcaster through working with an agency. And all you guests need to understand that that host is really getting paid zero in the process. So keep that in mind. As well, another drawback for podcasters working with an agency is there could be the potential mismatch of a guest being recommended to a podcast, and there's no correlation, there's no reason why that guest would ever be on that show. And you're like, why is this happening? So you have a podcast for moms who are single mothers with toddlers, and you get a guest recommendation for an author who's written a book on roofing, like how to fix the roof of your house. And you're like, well, thanks, but I don't really see the match here. So you want to be careful of any potential mismatches that might happen. There's always a risk of receiving guests who really don't align perfectly with what your podcast audience is expecting of you. And you are the goalkeeper to keep people out of your podcast that have no match with your audience. That's your job. So make sure that you actually vet any suggestions from a podcast agency. Don't just accept it. Don't just anticipate or believe that this agency has done all their homework on your show. I would say many agencies don't even really listen to your show in full length and have a good understanding of what your show's about. Some will. Some really good ones will, but some won't. So understand that there's a potential mismatch that could happen to you as a podcaster being offered up guests that really have no business being on your show. And as well, there's kind of a loss of a personal touch between the host and the guest. It's that middle person that's in the middle of the two. So I know for me, I have an author podcast, and I'll have agencies reach out all the time. And it's interesting when I go to set up the pre-interview, because I do a pre-interview with all my guests before we record. I don't know who to send the pre-interview link to, because the agency reaches out on behalf of the author. The author's nowhere on the email, and the agency sets it all up. Now, I've even had agencies request to be on the recording in the background. It's okay, I'm here to connect with the author, technically not really the agency. So just realize that sometimes when agencies act on behalf of a guest, you don't get as much personal one-on-one time with the guest yourself. So keep that in mind. I've always had to ask my guests after we've had a pre-interview, now, am I copying the agency when I email you the link for recording? And then as well, the guest will say, well, my agency has all my bio and images. Oh, okay. So now I'm working with two people. Just understand there's the potential loss of personal touch that can happen when working with an agency as a perspective of a podcaster. So that's kind of the drawbacks for podcasters and also the benefits for podcasters. Let's focus more on the guests now. What are some of the benefits for guests working with an agency, getting you onto podcasts? What are some benefits? Now, I go on podcasts as a guest. I don't work with an agency. It's just me. And it's generally, I work with people that I've had on my show. They invite me on their show, which is great. So I'm not using an agency. I'm not actively trying to get onto 1,000 podcasts just so I can cross that off my list. I'm not into that. I would much rather do quality podcasts instead of quantity. I'm not into this whole game about how many podcasts can I get on. That doesn't serve me. I'm not here to get a ribbon. I'm here to build relationships. And if I do one podcast interview a year and it's solid and strengthening and it builds up the host, then I'm happy to do that. So if you're looking for a guest for your show, reach out. I'd love to come on your podcast. We can talk podcasting all day long because I love it. What are some benefits for guests for working with an agency? How about increased exposure? How much can you do as an author, as a parent, as a business leader? You're a busy person. So for you to get out there and to do all this exposure on your own is going to take a lot of work. Guesting agencies can really help you secure appearances on relevant podcasts and expand your reach as a guest and your visibility in the space. The agencies that do it well will get you in front of the right podcasters. So that exposure is going to help you grow your business, your coaching, sell your book, whatever it is. That exposure is going to help you in the long term. So definitely leverage them for that as well. We've talked about it on the podcaster side, but for the guest side, that time efficiency is there as well. Guests can save considerable time and effort just by outsourcing the process of and finding podcasts, doing all the behind the scenes work to make it happen. You're going to save time by working with a guesting agency. And then it's kind of like being represented by like a lawyer would represent you in court, or your real estate agent helps you buy a house. You're being represented by someone who knows their stuff. And it just kind of sets you up as a little bit more professional. And these agencies can really help present you as a guest in the best possible light. They can help you craft your pitches or help you with your bio, your headshots, your website. They've got a lot of other tools they can offer to you. So an agency might make a great idea for you if you're starting out as a guest and you're frustrated trying to do it yourself. An agency might be the right choice for you. That being said, just like we talked about on the podcast hosting side, for the guest side, there could be some potential drawbacks for you as a guest in working with an agency. What could those be? Well, here's three. So you want to sign up with an agency, you want them to represent you, get you on podcasts. What could be some drawbacks to this, Dave? What could happen? Well, first is cost. The primary downside for guests is associated with hiring a guesting agency, and sometimes the cost can be quite high. And they generally would like to work with you for a period of time, not just a week or 5 episodes or 5 podcasts. They want to work with you for a longer period of time. So you need to know up front and do your research on how much is it going to cost me as a guest to use an agency, and does the cost outweigh the time that you save? So you need to make sure you do what's right for you. How much money can you invest in this? And use that as a guiding light as you decide whether or not you want to work with an agency. As well, you're going to lose a little bit of control over which shows you go on and which shows you don't. As a guest, you can always suggest podcasts that you're interested in to your agency, but they generally have a list of podcasts they prefer to put you on because the results might be better. You may say to them, I want to be on the Joe Rogan podcast. Your agency would be like, great, we'll reach out to the show. But I'm pretty well sure that Joe Rogan's not be very interested in having you on the show, especially if he doesn't know who you are or his team. And the agency knows they're not going to be very successful in doing so. They want to be successful for you. So you're going to lose a little bit of control over what shows you go on if you don't have a clear expectation of shows you're interested in. But again, remember, it's no guarantee that they can get you onto those podcasts, but they do have a list, most likely, of podcasts they would have had more success with that you were most likely to be on. But this is a conversation you need to have with them to lessen the lack of control that you have over the shows you go on. As well, there's a potential, possibly, that you might get actually overexposed on podcasting. What does that mean? Well, I can tell when somebody's working with a very aggressive agency because they're on a lot of shows, like a lot. And again, that could be an advantage and a disadvantage all in itself. Because if we hear you on 100 podcasts saying 100 times saying the same thing over and over again, after about the 50th time hearing you on a show, I can almost parrot back to you everything that you're going to say because I've heard you so many times. So you might actually be overexposing yourself by being on too many podcasts in a period of time. Your audience might, well, I know your community that supports you, they're not going to be interested in hearing that you've been on your 300th episode. They'll be like, really? Like, we've heard enough. So just keep that in mind. Don't let yourself become overexposed by being on too many podcasts. So say some pros and cons, just to recap. From the guest side of you, point of view, a pro, it's time saving, it's access to a wider podcast network, professional representation is there as a pro. And as a guest, the cons, it can be costly. You can have less control over the podcasts that you can go on, and there's a potential to be overexposed. And from a podcast host perspective, a pro of working with an agency is, again, access to high-quality guests, time-saving and guest acquisition, having them on your show, and consistent content flow. You're going to get more and more people on a consistent basis. But the cons, from a podcast host perspective, working with an agency, there's no financial compensation to you as the host of the show. All the money goes from the guest to the agency. The potential for guest show mismatch is there. And there's less personal connection with the guest when you're working through somebody in the middle between you and the guest. So as we look at podcast guesting agencies, they really can provide you some very valuable resources and services as a guest and a host. But their effectiveness depends on the specific needs and circumstances of both you as a guest and you as a podcast host. So in a balanced approach, what I would suggest, considering both the benefits and the potential drawbacks, it's crucial for all parties involved in the podcast guesting process to benefit. If at any part of this chain between guest, agency, and host, somebody is not being served or someone is not being benefited through the process or rewarded through the process, back to, again, the host not making any money from this, any weakness in that chain can cause something to break. So my suggestion to you as a guest, work with a great agency, talk to other guests who work with agencies, find the right one that works for you, interview them, look for results, talk to the hosts of podcasts where an agency was used to see how it worked, how the host felt working with the agency. Do your homework. To the agencies. Think about I don't even know how this works. I don't even know if it's possible. But I know you listen to the show. From an agency's perspective, the money that comes to you from a guest, is there anything you can do to benefit the host of a podcast? In that they do all the work from a hosting, interviewing, promotion, all of the things that happen after the interview. The host carries the weight of that responsibility, where the agency doesn't, to some degree. And the money that comes to you as an agency never seems to trickle down to the host. So I don't know how that works. If there's a solution, I'm asking a question more than trying to provide a solution. But I'm just saying, if there was something that benefited the host of a podcast in this whole guest agency podcast collaboration, anything that would benefit the host, I think would make it more inviting to work with more agencies. So it's a question. And I'm interested from your perspective as a podcast host or as a guest, how has it been working with an agency for your show or getting on shows as a guest. I'd love to hear your feedback. If you have a great example of a great agency, then please reach out to me. Let's focus on the positive things happening in the space and encourage more people to work with these great agencies. If you're an agency yourself and you're seeing success and you'd like to come on and have a conversation about this in more detail and fill me in as a podcast host who doesn't understand the agency side as much because I don't have an agency, I'd love to have you on. So howtopodcast.ca is the website. Reach out. Let me know. I'd love to hear your feedback. There's always my speak pipe there. And let's do something that's great for the guest, for the agency, and the podcast host. Because I think all of us need to win for this to be successful. And again, if you're not feeling it, do your research, ask questions, and reach out to somebody who's doing it. Because then you're going to get more accurate information from the source instead of just Googling it and hoping you find the right thing. Thanks for listening to the show. More episodes coming up. Remember, November is our National Podcast Post Month. NaPodPoMo, as we call it in the biz. And there'll be 30 episodes in a row coming out to you in November. Wow, there's a lot of podcast episodes, so be aware your feed is going to fill up pretty fast. Now, you don't have to listen to them all on the day they come out, but there'll be a nice, rich library for you to listen to when you have the chance. Thanks for being here. And again, I'd love to hear from you. howtopodcast.ca. Thanks for being here. Keep podcasting. Keep being you, because again, there's a shortage of you in this world and we need more of you. Thanks for listening. So you're a podcaster and you podcast alone. You are in your home, you're in your studio, you're in your closet, and you podcast. And you put everything out there in the world and you're thinking, man, I'd love to meet another podcaster and not feel so alone. I wish there was a way to meet up with other podcasters and talk about my journey, ask my questions in a safe place where others there are also podcasters at different levels. Some people have been doing this a long time. Maybe some podcasters are brand new like me. And I'd love to be able to ask questions and do community with others. Maybe find a guest for my show or be a guest and ask a question that's bothering me about podcasting that I haven't seen or heard or got an answer to. I wish there was a group for me. Dave, do you know of a group where they do all of that and they do group hugs, virtual group hugs? Yeah, we do. It's our meetup. And you know, guess what? You're invited to come to our meetups. They are amazing. Not because of me by any stretch of imagination. It's because they're great because of the people who show up. You're going to meet some of the nicest podcasters you've ever met. There's no judgment. There's no talking down to you. It's not about me. It's about the group. And there's many times where I don't even have to talk. Each of the people coming bring great expertise and insights that can help you grow your show, to help you be a better person. And they're there to support you. It's our meetups, and you can find them at our howtopodcast.ca website. Come join us. There's over 200 people in our group, and we'd love to have you there. Lots of room for you. Come be a part of our meetups and meet other podcasters. Don't do it alone. Podcasting should never be done alone. Come join us. howtopodcast.ca. See you at our meetups.